But the US has for more than a decade been urging European countries to spend more. Why? It's not for the defense of Europe, but rather to provide ready forces in support of US-led out-of-area interventions in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, perhaps later in Iran, Pakistan, and various African countries. European countries to date, and for the most part, and with good reason I would say, have thought the better of this. On the other hand, events in Ukraine have frightened many in Europe, and it's likely there will be some uptick in defense spending in some NATO countries. However, if the Ukraine settles down to a lower level of civil conflict, if regular Russian troops don't come west, then European countries will likely return to a preference for spending no more than 2% of their GDP on military power. Clearly, a framework of a new Cold War is more persuasive than the Ukraine crisis by itself for sustaining higher defense spending in Europe. And finally, 3, a small example, Lauren Thompson, in his column in Forbes this week, invokes the Russian threat for why the US needs to get more serious about investing more in homeland defenses against ballistic missile attack. Until recently, advocates for such investments had to rely on the fairly unpersuasive case of a North Korean attack. Now, it would be one thing if a new Cold War were limited to a Cold War with Russia. It probably won't have much lasting organizing traction as such, because of reasons others have mentioned. Russia is a declining power. If we play our strategic cards with any wisdom at all, Russian power tactics in the near abroad need not be much of a global concern. But allow the construct of a new Cold War to spread its rhetorical wings to encompass future relations with China, and we have an entirely different matter. A confrontational Cold War framework with China relations would be close to the very worst way we could go. China is, of course, a rising power. We need to be working to build partnership, not confrontation, with China by helping to construct an inclusive common regional security and economic framework. However, should the US government decide it needs to mobilize the American people for an arms race with China, a new Cold War encompassing both Russia and China will be a convenient construct in support of this purpose. A Cold War framework for our relations with Russia, China, and any other powers that might eventually align with them could easily result in the addition of $200 to $300 billion in annual security expenditures. This preference for a larger, more resource-intensive national security sector will mean less resources for other investments needed to sustain our economic strength. A good case can be made, I believe, that if we go the way of a new Cold War, we will hasten the relative decline of our economy, while other nations who opt out of the new Cold War will come away the winners. Thank you. James Carroll, Boston Globe.
Good morning. First, I'm honored to be a part of this distinguished panel. I intend to narrow the focus somewhat because I see everything through the eyes of the son of a nuclear high priest. Thus, Cold War engine, past and future, the bomb. At a gathering dedicated to imagining economic futures, it may seem off to dust off the old issue of arms control. But the Cold War, past and future, is the lens through which this entire session is looking at the economic dilemma. My assumption is that the Cold War engine, past and future, is the bomb. If, as seems likely, the world stands on the threshold of a new nuclear arms race, with its champions once again in Washington and Moscow, the structure of the world economy will once again find its foundation not in productivity, but in the threat of radical destruction. The history is well known to everyone in this room, but a review is to the point. The first Cold War began with the bomb. Historians assert now that Hiroshima was at least as much, a first shot against the Kremlin as it was a last shot against the Axis powers. A demonstration of the bomb might impress Russia, so said Secretary of State James Burns, who, like most, assumed a long-term U.S. atomic monopoly. Indeed, the demonstration that the United States would not hesitate to use the absolute weapon against an all but defeated Japan effectively stoked the age-old Russian paranoia and quickened Moscow's haste to build its own bomb. In 1949, as already referred to, a full decade before the CIA predicted, the Soviets had the bomb, and American paranoia came into its own. The Red Scare, already referred to. From little over 100 nuclear weapons, all atomic bombs, in 1950, the U.S. arsenal grew through the course of the next decade to something over 19,000 bombs and warheads. A mad escalation that itself lays bare the insanity of the arms race that was then fully underway. Ultimately, the U.S. and the USSR would construct more than 100,000 nuclear weapons. Insanity, full stop, period. The looming threat of Armageddon was the core meaning of the Cold War, and only the arms control movement staved off the cataclysm. Of course, the Cold War assured the post-World War II permanence of the U.S. war economy, a national security totalism that for generations squandered the nation's genius on war preparation and underwrote, in John Kenneth Galbraith's classic phrase, the private affluence and public squalor that still divide and poison the civic culture of the United States to this day. The world was saved from the Cold War hair trigger when arms control gave way to arms reduction, a turn that came with the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. The threat of a new Cold War today is defined by the fact that last year the U.S. State Department formally declared that Moscow was in violation of that INF treaty, having tested a new ground-launched cruise missile. This past fall, Russia successfully launched a new intercontinental ballistic missile. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine is only part of the story of what threatens. And Russia is only part of the story, too. President Obama, coming into office, put the completion of nuclear arms reduction at the center of his purpose. As the only nuclear power to have used a nuclear weapon, he declared in Prague in 2009, the United States has a moral responsibility to act. So today I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. Yes, we can. Apparently not. Obama has been presiding over a golden moment, but one with an apocalyptic deadline. The weapons and delivery systems of the world's nuclear arsenal are aging fast, and further large reductions in the arsenal had to begin before pressures to launch a program for the wholesale replacement of those weapon systems grew too strong to resist. It did not happen. A recent piece by the New York Times science correspondent William J. Broad made Obama's nuclear shortfall dramatic. Cuts to the nuclear stockpile initiated by George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush totaled 14,801 weapons. Obama's reductions to this point, after 6 years, 507 weapons. In 2010, a New START treaty between Moscow and Washington capped future deployed nukes at 1,500. As of this October, the US still deploys 1,642 of them, and Russia 1,643. Neither nation achieved START levels, which do not count the thousands of stored and readily rearmed and targeted weapons. In order to get the votes of Senate Republicans to ratify the START treaty, Obama agreed, a devil's bargain, to lay the groundwork for a vast modernization of the US nuclear arsenal at an estimated future cost of more than $1 trillion. That modernization, in fact, is underway. Not even President Obama speaks anymore of the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. The conventional wisdom is that given Putin's belligerence, it is politically impossible for the one-time abolitionist president to make unilateral cuts in the US nuclear arsenal down, for example, to the still fully deterring levels of weapons counted in the hundreds instead of in the thousands. Such cuts, at least, would keep the vision of eventual nuclear elimination in sight. The undergirding assumption of the incipient new Cold War between Russia and America is that the nuclear arsenal will be permanent. This, of course, not only violates the dream that defined Obama's early public life, but it violates the law, since the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty requires all nuclear weapon states to take effective measures toward disarmament. And proliferation is to the point, of course, because once the NPT bargain is broken by nuclear states, non-nuclear states, decisively including Iran, will be hell-bent on acquiring nukes of their own. The cascade of proliferation will follow. Because of decisions being taken now in Washington, no American president will ever again be able to embrace the ideal of a world free of nuclear weapons. If an Obama could not do it, who could? As the Cold War of yore was defined by a runaway nuclear arms race, so will be the Cold War of the future. Economic consequences? Can the U.S. afford the trillion-dollar reinvention of the nuclear arsenal? What about the ongoing squandering of human capital on the structures of death instead of life? But of course, economics is the least of it. What about the human future, when the genocidal weapon has been defined as normal? Finally, one last thought, and I offer it with a due modesty. What prepared Gorbachev and Reagan for that 1987 breakthrough? The move from arms control to arms reduction, which ultimately ended their Cold War.